So, and let me see. So, hello, I see people are joining us very quickly. So as people are joining, welcome to the Newark Museum of Art virtually. I'm Amy Simon Hopwood, Associate Curator of Decorative Arts here at the Newark Museum of Art. And I'll be introducing our speaker, Elaine Ngan, in a few moments. But we just want to give people time to join us. So welcome. And I'll repeat this several times, but for those of you who have not yet attended a virtual museum crawl here at the Newark Museum of Art, we will have a presentation, and then we will also have time for questions and answers. So for those of you on Zoom, please use the chat function on the bottom of your screen so that you can submit questions that we will discuss later. And for those of you on Facebook Live, we will then be able to, if you enter your questions into the comments field, we'll be able to answer those as well. So it looks like we have people continuing to join us. I know people are stepping into the virtual meeting space. So we'll just give a few more moments. And I'll be quiet for just one moment, and then I'll be back. Okay, well, looks like we're still waiting for a few people, but again, for those of you who have just joined us, I want to introduce myself. I'm Amy Simon Hopwood, Associate Curator of Decorative Arts here at the Newark Museum of Art. And as you can see on your screen as well, we have Elaine Ngan from the Sun Museum in Hong Kong. I will hold off on introducing her and speaking more about the program until more people join us. But for those of you who have just joined us, and I'll repeat again, we will have a Q&A session. So please feel free in the chat or Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen as the presentation goes along. You can enter your questions. And for those of you joining us on Facebook Live, please use the comments field as well. And we'll be able to answer those questions later on. And we'll give a few moments for people to join us, but we're very excited. We have a substantial audience, and let me tell you a bit about our museum crawl for those of you who are attending the first time. Given the situation with the coronavirus and quarantine, the museum really wanted to promote both our collections and develop relations and cross-collection work with other institutions. So the Museum Crawl is one of our virtual programs, and so we welcome curators and artists from other institutions who will then speak about theirs. We are delighted to be virtually meeting with Elaine Ngan from the Sun Museum in Hong Kong. And I think there will be more people joining us, but why don't we go ahead and start? So officially, everyone, welcome to the Newark Museum of Art, our virtual museum crawl. I'm Amy Simon Hopwood, Associate Curator for Decorative Arts, and I'm very delighted to introduce Elaine Ngan from Assistant Curator at the Sun Museum in Hong Kong. She has a master's in museum studies, and she also has a background in anthropology, has worked in a variety of arts institutions in Hong Kong, and today she will be speaking to us about the Sun Museum. So Elaine, welcome, and I look forward to hearing.
Thank you, Amy. Hi fellows from the States. I'm Elaine. I'm from a private museum in Hong Kong. I'm glad to see you all in the virtual space. I hope to introduce more on my museum and our collection. So You can go to the slide. Yes. So we're a Hong Kong private museum aims to promote appreciation on Hong Kong art and Chinese art. So giving you a background that in Hong Kong, most of the museums are public and government funded. So we are one of the rare few that are privately funded by charitable organizations. So our founder of the Simon Soon Foundation is an art lover and a collector. So he started this museum in the 2015. So we are a very young and upcoming institute trying to promote art in Hong Kong. And if we can go to the next slide. So we are hosted in one of the floors of a public building instead of a purposely built structure in Hong Kong. So in this perfect, amazing view, you can see on the right top corner, that's SML Tower. That's the building we locate in. And we're along the harbor waterfront in Hong Kong. So we get an amazing view. The next slide, please. Yeah, so we're directly facing the coast, and we have a good view in the museum space, and we can even see the sunset sometime. The next slide, please. So we are quite a small museum with the whole floor as the exhibition space and also outdoor courtyard. The next slide, please. Yes, so even we're located in a factory area surrounded by other tall buildings, we still have this courtyard for some fresh air, and it's also a social space for our audience. Next slide, please. So quite interesting is our museum design. It's inspired by a traditional Chinese concept of the 5 elements. So as you can see, it's the metal, water, fire, wood, and earth. So it's actually quite an old concept and philosophy that believes in by the harmonious balance of these elements, that it will give life and vitality to the space. So our museum is decorated based on these 5 elements color, like we have a green corridor, and our exhibition space, we have yellow, whitish hall on one way, and then the red wall on the other hand. So it's quite interesting, and the designer believes this would be quite an interesting reference to our traditions in terms of the museum design. The next slide, please. So our collection is mainly on Hong Kong oil painting, as well as a small number of Western painting, Chinese painting, and also porcelain art. So although our collection is not huge, of course, comparing to the Newark Museum of Art, we are we're really tiny, but we're still quite proud, considering we are the only art institute that focuses on collecting Hong Kong oil painting. It is less popular, or should I say it has a lesser attention in the Hong Kong art field, because most of the public art museum in Hong Kong would focus more on Chinese art. That is like the signature of our history, and also contemporary art installation has become a more representational icon of Hong Kong art. But yeah, actually there is quite a considerable number of local oil painters that creates works that are amazing, and it's also show how Hong Kong art is influenced by the West and even other culture. So in this work, it's painted by Alex Ho. It is an abstract interpretation of the landscape, the water and the misty shore. So he's influenced by Zhao Walqi, a renowned oil painter that is active in France and the USA back in the 1950s and onwards. So Alex's works himself are characterized by abstract imageries and the aesthetics of traditional Chinese literati painting. As you can see, he used oil paint, but somehow transformed it into ink art. So he used ink splashing technique and also deliberate blank space to evoke imagination. And also the brushstrokes is a reference to the traditional Chinese calligraphy, that is cursive script that gives a carefree and expressive tone throughout the painting. The next slide, please. This is another painting from a collection by Chu Long Cheng. He is influenced by socialist realism. So his work are mostly honest reflection of urban social space and the social life. You may recognize the skyscrapers. That's the key icon of Hong Kong city, as well as the business center. But quite interesting is that the composition is using the hustling city background in contrast to the tram in the middle. The tramway is actually one of our earliest form of public transport in the metropolis since the 1900s. So it has a long history and it's remained in the city center even today, but has now become the slowest form of transportation. So this is quite a visually striking scenery that has put the modern hustling city as a background in contrast to this traditional slow-paced transport. The next slide, please. And these two paintings are from Joseph Choi. Apparently he's influenced by Cubism from the West, that he transformed the landscape into simple and divided geometric shapes. That with contrasting color tone, he emphasized the lighting effect, even in this seemingly flattening composition, that he creates a three-dimensional image of the landscape. The next slide. The next slide, yes. This one is another landscape painting we have from another Hong Kong artist, Pui Kong Wong. So this is painted in the suburb island part of Hong Kong. His work is inspired by Fauvism and Cubism. So with a rather flat surface and distorted tree and houses imageries, he uses vivid colors characterized by the Fauvists, and also irregular shapes that are rendered in carefree brushstrokes to create a very powerful, expressive sceneries of Hong Kong. The next slide, please. So this is another work from a young Hong Kong artist, Iris Wu. He is influenced by representational art. So his realist still life painting often features trivial, ordinary stuff like, as you can see, a dining table or like a potted plant on the rooftop, or even the sink. So his precise observation allows him to record minute changes of objects and perfect lighting effects that are so real and three-dimensional, almost like photography. So in order to capture this perfect moment, he has to wait for like a certain hour, and that gives that exact same sunlight effect. So usually his painting could take up to like months or even a year to complete. The next slide, please. The last painting we have here is by a young female artist, Kai Song. So as you can see, this painting creates a dramatic visual impact that with the collapsing building as well as the man worried facial expression. So unlike the West, Hong Kong, we are known for a very crowded space and in lack of housing. And it's also quite a common practice, sadly to say, that we bring down old buildings and build skyscrapers on top. So this is the artist's emotional response to the torn down of public housing in Hong Kong. The artist is well versed in oil painting as well as Chinese meticulous painting. So her way to highlight the facial features, enhance the three-dimensional effect, and also add to the dramatic visual impact to the painting. So most of our collection are acquired directly from living artists. So that's quite unique comparing to other museums. And it's quite convenient for us to know more about the meaning behind from the works. The next slide, please. So now I would like to introduce another collection that apart from oil painting, we also have a small collection of porcelain art by a Hong Kong artist named Chu Long Cheng. So Cheng practiced painting under Elaine Ngan School, which was started by the first group of artists that studied in Japan back in the early 20th century. So combining both Western technique and also Japanese painting, their works are characterized by the use of shades and lights that enhance the sense of distance and perspective. And their works are usually realistic depiction of the scenery. So in this collection, you'll see that Zhang has transformed the traditional Chinese ink art and adapted onto porcelain art. The works are manufactured by a local porcelain factory named Yudong China Work, which is one of the earliest porcelain factories in Hong Kong, dated back in the early 20th century, and is remaining now the only factory in Hong Kong. So he replaced ink and color with porcelain glaze to paint this landscape onto the dish. The next slide, please. So we have here is a set of 4 dishes that has painted 4 seasons landscape. So the one before is spring, this one is summer. So Chang follows this branch of Elaine Ngan School art in Hong Kong that advocates both realistic and expressive depiction. But his style is giving rather simple composition with nimble brushstrokes and light colors that gives a poetic charm to the scenery. And you can see that he uses ink wash technique that is quite signature in traditional ink art, and it gives a misty impact to the painting. The next slide. So that's autumn landscape. As you can see, a rather light color tone. And then the next slide is the winter. So that's the last one of the dish collection. So as you can see, the dish has a very small surface that the composition of the painting has to be precise and also ingenious to captivate. So it's common in traditional Chinese painting as well as Japanese painting as well, that usually the artist would paint the landscape out of the canvas or out of the frame. So in order to evoke a more transcendent image of the overwhelming landscape. So this is a small but yet meaningful collection because it actually embodies both traditional and contemporary practice of Hong Kong and Chinese art. It's actually applying this contemporary version of traditional ink art onto another traditional art form that is the porcelain, and then produced by a historical manufacturer, and then resulted in an excellent example of revitalization with a contemporary adaptation. The next slide, please. So as I say, we have a small collection. So we usually collaborate with artists and private collectors in order to put forth different exhibitions every 2 to 3 months. So we are quite a busy team. And instead of a permanent exhibition, we do themed exhibition regularly. So this year we have launched an oil painting exhibition. We call it the Chinese Traditions in Western Oil. So we displayed some masterpieces from the 20th century together with our own collection. So this is one of the work from that exhibition is from Zhao Ki, the oil painting master I mentioned before. He's one of the Chinese artists that studied in France, Paris, and later received worldwide recognition and fame. So he combines both Chinese and Western aesthetic techniques, and then later influenced by Paul Klee, a Swiss artist, to develop his signature use of symbols that are inspired by traditional Chinese visual culture. So his work is still an inspiration for many Hong Kong and Chinese artists. The next slide, please. And of course, we also do exhibitions on ceramics and porcelain antiques. So this is from the exhibition Folklore Porcelain, that we display this amazing porcelain work dated back in the Ming and Qing dynasty. So you can see this is a blue and white porcelain pot dated back in the late Ming to early Qing dynasty. But quite interesting is that many of these delicate decorations are actually referenced to the local folklore, like historical stories or myths, or even auspicious motifs. So this one in particular is from the scene from the story called Romance of the Three Kingdoms. So it's the scene where the protagonist, the general Guan Yu, is trying to save his friend from the war. The next slide, please. Yes, so of course, as a museum to promote Chinese art and Hong Kong art, we have exhibition on traditional Chinese ink painting. This is from another recent exhibition that we borrow from private collectors. So Wu Kunkan, a very prominent artist, one of the 4 monks in the early Qing dynasty. That is a prominent master in ink art history in China. So this is an example dated back in the late 17th century, an example of sand painting that draws a monk meditating in the forest. So his scenery and the figure are meticulously depicted. The artist purposely draws the clothing of that monk rather rigid and with ripple lines that resembles with the waterfall at the back. So it actually immerses the monk into the landscape. So these are some of the amazing works that we have displayed, and is some of them are our collection. So I hope you guys enjoy, and this is, I think it's my presentation so far.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Elaine. And I just have, if we go to the next slide, please, I have a few things to make a connection to the Newark Museum of Art's collection. And just to give everyone a little history, the Arts of Global Asia collection was established with the Newark Museum of Art's founding in 1909. Our first acquisition was a substantial collection of Japanese artwork and objects, and that provided the foundation of a collection that now encompasses over 30,000 objects. Within the Arts of Global Asia collection, we have the Chinese collection, and that has about 8,500 objects that span 3 millennia. And for today, in thinking about the Sun Museum and this kind of contemporary Chinese and Hong Kong art, as well as building upon the tradition, we selected 2 images just to briefly give you an overview. So this is Wang Jun's Chinese Dream of China from 2005. So very obviously referring to the long-standing history of Chinese embroidery. But as you can see from the caption, it was produced recently by Chinese embroiderers on plastic. And so this idea, as Elaine has been talking about, of modern contemporary art, but referencing such the long and rich history of Chinese art and many variations of arts. So next slide, please. And here we have Anjou on an eternity. And again, building upon everything that Elaine spoke about in terms of the scroll. So I don't know if you have any comments for either of these, Elaine, not having seen them much, but we just wanted to show kind of the parallels between the collections of our 2 institutions.
Yeah, they are quite amazing works. It also shows how contemporary artists also inspired by traditional works, especially this calligraphy scroll that is quite a recent contemporary work by Anjou. The seemingly layered calligraphy is also quite an abstract interpretation of Chinese culture.
Right. No, and having because this is obviously not my area of expertise as decorative arts curator, but I was fascinated by that blue band at the lower portion of the scroll refers to the traditional use of textiles, but here the artist used a blue band of color, so really abstracting the historic format. But now we have a few questions, so we can move to that portion. And for those of all of you joining us on Zoom, please feel free to send your questions in through the Q&A on your Zoom screen. And we can also take questions through the comments field from Facebook Live. So we do have a question for you, Elaine, I think looking at all of the works that you spoke about, where do the artists obtain their education in the Hong Kong art scene? Is there a specific school? Do they travel abroad? Obviously it would be a variety, but.
Yeah, if we're talking about Hong Kong artists, in terms of this generation, some of the artists that I introduced, they may study abroad in, like for Iris Wu, he studied in Australia on fine art. But most of the artists studied in China or in Hong Kong. So we do have quite a number of fine art school that has nurtured a lot of local artists that are familiar with both Chinese art history as well as different Western technique and philosophy.
Right, right. And I do think fascinating also with the ceramics, we're building upon the Japanese tradition. So not needing to go to the West, you can stay within the Asian community and build cross-culturally that way as well.
Yeah. Actually, if I can give more information for Chinese oil painting, especially in this field, back in the early 20th century, a lot of Chinese art students have studied abroad, mainly in Paris or in Japan.
Yeah.
So these 2 areas are the most influential source of education for these artists. And then when they went back to China, they became teachers and professors that also spread these techniques and the idea of the West to their students. So that comes to the contemporary works in Hong Kong.
Right, so you really have those generations of teaching and teaching those various traditions. Wonderful. And then we have another question. you spoke about really developing these relationships with the contemporary artists and knowing them. And so we have a question about, do you know and have you spoken with the artists about how they got their personal inspiration for their artworks?
Yeah, maybe I can use the example from Iris Wu painting that has painted the dining room. So his source of inspiration is the really trivial things in life. So he believes that by observing carefully around your surrounding or even the private space, like a home scenery, the beautiful things are the minute changes of how human and objects interact. So the relationships, like if we move the table or after lunch, the messy scene of the table, for him it's quite beautiful in the sense that he wants to capture this exact moment in life or in his daily life that has become many of his themes in his work.
And I have also an interesting question, thinking about the traditions of literature, both the Chinese literature, some of which has been translated, both historic and contemporary translated for an American audience, and also the history of American literature speaking about China over the generations. And so we have a question about, and one that comes to mind is, kind of the historical writings of Pearl S. Buck, but also there are contemporary artists now writing about China from an American perspective, or even Chinese Americans. And so, so we have many layers of interpretations, both of Chinese literature as well as literature in America, talking about China from different perspectives. And so do any of these artists that you have worked with at the Sun Museum, do they, have any of them used, the question is, have any of these artists been inspired by Chinese or American literature about China in their paintings? Kind of a very big question, but something interesting to think about, how not just the painterly tradition, but all of the arts inspire each other. So not to put you on the hot seat, but this idea of artists being inspired by a variety of artwork. And I think—
Do you mean like how they are inspired by Chinese traditions? Or?
Right. Well, thinking about, you already, so I'm just trying to build on the question, because I wanted to honor the listener's question, but what you had mentioned about with the porcelain, where the teacup showed the image of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. So, so that's a historical object being influenced by Chinese literature. But do any of the artists, and possibly it hasn't come up, but do you have any artists that have been inspired, contemporary artists inspired by literature in some form?
Yeah, of course. I think especially for contemporary Hong Kong artists, they always in one another are influenced or inspired by traditional Chinese culture. So as a collection that I've shown, even in terms of this oil painting, which is a Western art form, but when Hong Kong painters interpret, or when they practice this art form, they would draw back inspiration from their culture, like especially most of them like to paint landscape, which is a signature theme used in traditional Chinese art. And also one of the highlight is that they are always trying to portray a poetic charm, poetic ambience in their work. So even it is a realistic painting or in an abstract painting, for traditional Chinese literati painting, it's always about the poetic imageries, and the reason behind is never an exact copy of the landscape, but it's how the artist's emotional are embedded in the painting. So this could be quite a traditional trace, even in Hong Kong artists' works. But if you're talking about the American perspective of China, I think it's quite difficult to say, because I think a number of painters that I have encountered, they might have studied abroad, perhaps in the States, but it's also quite universal in a sense.
Right. And also, obviously you're a Hong Kong museum with Hong Kong artists, and while sitting here in America, our literature is very important, but from the perspective on a Hong Kong artist, American literature may not have the same impact because it's a different perspective. So, but I have a completely different question. As someone was very curious about the actual size of the painted plates with the Four Seasons. Are those kind of parallel to a dinner plate? Are they just to get a sense of the perspective?
Yeah, it's parallel to a dinner plate. So that's around the size of my face. It's pretty small, considering they can put such a enormous painting of the landscape on such a small dish is quite outstanding. Right.
And it's, as you were saying, this idea of it's a very small scale, and this aesthetic idea of not necessarily showing everything in exactly, and also, as you said, the scroll tradition of having some of the actual landscape not even present in the image. So to work with such a small plate with such big ideas is very powerful. And then I do have another question. You've spoken a lot about how, the Hong Kong artists are building off of Chinese traditions, and as well as Japanese and Western. And one person wanted to know, is there any significant difference in the technique or the artistic kind of outlook of the Hong Kong artists, in comparison to Chinese artists from the mainland? Is there, or is it?
It's quite hard to say, because a lot of the prominent Hong Kong artists are actually moved from the mainland to Hong Kong. Of course, they are experienced with the mainland art culture, and also they have gradually influenced the Hong Kong artists. But I think somehow Hong Kong artists tend to lean on a more realistic style of depiction, rather than some of the works or most of the works by mainland Chinese artists in terms of painting. It could be expressive. That is more on traditional Chinese ink art that are expressive, or it could be meticulously depicted, or expressive freestyle brush works. But for Hong Kong artists, they tend to drawing more on very ordinary daily life surroundings, and also perhaps inspired by the events in the society, or so I believe they have quite a broadened or even down to earth themes that are relevant to their lives, and also provoke a more impact on viewers.
Oh, wonderful. So that's interesting. So maybe not, there is a distinction, but you have to kind of work through think about the artwork. So, and I had one question, and thinking about how you're working with lots of contemporary artists and you're developing these exhibitions to work with them. And so obviously there are the art schools, but has the Sun Museum kind of really developed relationships with the arts organizations? And how are you probably constantly looking for new artists and seeing how established artists are developing? So could you speak to that?
Yeah, we among our exhibition, we're mostly engaging with emerging artists. Because as a private institute, we believe that those are the artists that needs more attention or like support in order to show the audience. There are a lot of different artists in Hong Kong as well as in China, or even different art forms. But on the other hand, as a private museum, we get to work with a lot of private collectors. So this is quite a different from public museum, because they already have established their own huge collection, or they have connections with prominent artists. And somehow it may be difficult to invite private collectors, because there's but in terms of our museum, because our founder himself is a collector, so we do have quite a wide connection with local private collectors, and it is amazing that they do have quite a huge and even precious collections, like the antiques, and also really rare ink art that's even the public museum may not have such a funding to collect all these works. But as a private museum, we do like regular changes on our exhibition instead of like a permanent static exhibition. So we get to try on different things and showing more arts to the audience.
Wonderful. Well, that's wonderful, thinking about how the Sun Museum both promotes and supports emerging artists and then works with the collectors to really show things that might not be easily seen by the public. So it sounds like you're working with multiple communities. So well, thank you so much. I have one final comment. Someone just summed it all up and said, what a great museum. So it's been really, it sums it all up, and it's been really an honor to meet you here virtually and to learn more about the Sun Museum and have a better understanding about the Hong Kong and Chinese art scene. And here's someone else just said gorgeous. So it's really wonderful to meet you and introduce you to our museum community and learn more about yours. And we look forward to future connections with the two institutions. And before we wrap up, everyone, I do want to just let everyone know that our next virtual Newark Museum of Art at Home program will be this Friday at 7 p.m. And it's jazz sessions, an evening with Sheila Anderson. And for those of you who are familiar with our long-standing Jazz in the Garden program connected with our WBGO radio in Newark, we are bringing it back in virtual form. So please join us and host Sheila Anderson and get swept away in serenades of Desron Douglas and Brandy Younger as they perform jazz favorites. And so you can, if you are a member of the Newark Museum of Art, you will receive the email announcement. But for those of you who aren't, you can check on our Facebook page as well as our website. If you search newarkmuseumofart.org with the /NMOA at home, you will get all the weekly listings and you can register for Zoom or attend on Facebook. And our next museum crawl will be on July 8th with the Cleveland Museum of Art. So it's really a pleasure. And thank you so much for joining us from Hong Kong, Elaine. This has been really wonderful. Thank you so much.
See you.
And thank you everyone for attending. And so have a wonderful afternoon thinking about all this wonderful art from Hong Kong. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.